Welcome to this week's episode of Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. Lots of exciting news to share today, as we have each and every week for now approaching 40 years on this program. Started that many years ago by my now late father-in-law, Jack Nelson. The tradition continues today, courtesy of yours truly, Joel Garris. I am a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great folks who also happen to be certified financial fiduciaries as well, that stand ready, willing, and able to help you improve your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. So this week's program, we're going to go a little off script and talk about some more practical, maybe less financial things that you can do in the year prior to retirement. And what's interesting about these things that we're going to be talking about is that they, while not purely financial, they are options or things that you can do only if you are still working. You don't get to do them in retirement. So we're going to give you some things to do as you're approaching retirement. Make sure you take good notes on this one, because there's some valuable financial information in these tips. And then we're going to attempt to answer the question that I think a lot of people ask themselves, and that question is, how much money do you really need in a savings account? So that's sort of our topics du jour, if you will. If you missed the headlines this past week, you know that volatility returned, or should I say continued, in the markets this past week. We certainly encourage you to take a moment to review our August shows, because pretty much that entire month, we really focused on volatility. We focused on market volatility and what to do with market volatility. We focused on spending volatility in retirement and kind of how to address that, and really looked at a lot of those different types of more volatile things that are on people's minds. Of course, that would be chiefly political volatility as well. So we covered all three flavors of that volatility during the course of our August programming. So we encourage you to really dig into the archives, whether you're a fan of us over on YouTube or whether you subscribe to us through your favorite podcast channel. Check out those prior episodes to get a little perspective on volatility. And if you're not subscribed to us already, well, then you should be when you go and find us on these particular platforms. Make sure you hit the subscribe button as well. And that way, when we post new shows, you'll get instantly notified as well. We're going to start the show off with, I guess, some tips, if you will, for those that may be struggling with the fundamental concepts of getting to these topics that we're going to talk about on this week's program. The topics about, hey, I'm going to be retiring. What do I need to do sort of in the year leading up? I'm putting money into an emergency savings account. How much money do I really need to ultimately save? Both of those topics involve saving money, right? So kind of the first step of actually getting to the conversation about retirement or saving or establishing an emergency savings account is that you got to save money. So before we get to those topics, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some things that you can do to maybe improve your savings habit so that you actually wind up being able to retire or save money for emergencies. Now, some of these concepts, if you're a longtime radio listener or podcast listener to Dollars and Cents, you've probably heard some of these before, I would imagine. The reality is that some of them, though, are more pertinent to the current environment as well. We'll let you figure out which ones those are as we go through these 5 sort of tips to actually help you start to save money. The first is an oldie but a goodie. We've talked about that many, many times over the years on this program. And that is this notion of creating a budget and sticking with it. The best place to figure out where you can find money to save is to look at how you're spending money in the first place, right? I mean, that's the whole point of a budget. And ultimately looking at the money that's coming in, the income that's coming in, and the money that's going out, the expenses that are going out. Certainly looking at those numbers and keeping track of them, courtesy of a budget. Great way to start to figure out a way to ultimately begin to save money on a regular basis, which gets us directly to the second tip that we've got for how to start to save money, and that is to automate it. If you automate it, make it automatic in terms of moving a part of every paycheck into that employer sponsored retirement plan or into your emergency savings account, then ultimately by automating it, then you really do start to build the habit of saving on a regular basis, because by automating, you do in fact make it easier. If things are easier to do, then the reality is of us as human beings, we're more likely to then do it. Number 3, and this one is probably more applicable to today's world, make sure you take a moment to review your statements. The abundance of recurring charges that we as Americans have is just nothing short of stupendous, because think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it wasn't like every single thing had a recurring charge. So how you ultimately are getting your entertainment, how you're going to the gym, all of that is recurring charges. And what happens is people forget that they've got a recurring charge because there's so many different recurring charges. It's so many different platforms that ultimately you could very well be paying for something each and every month that you're not actually using. I remember one time here, maybe 3 years ago, I noticed Amazon Audible was constantly hitting my charge, and I had signed up for, I was traveling and signed up for, just sort of the trial subscription, which is kind of how they get you. And, I'd used the trial subscription. I was like, okay, not a big, for whatever reason, don't really like to have the book read to me. But then when I looked at my credit card statements, I was like, wait a minute, they're billing me $14.99 a month going forward. I am willing to bet that if you looked at your credit card statements or your bank statements, you would probably find at least one, maybe more, of those recurring charges that at the end of the day isn't really anything that you're using. Talk about a great way to find money to save. It's simply by stopping the withdrawal or the spending of those dollars on things that you aren't using in the first place. So make sure you review those account statements. Number 4, and kind of this, the tips to save money in the first place. Yeah, this one is unique to now, although it's probably always been around, but my goodness, if you've eaten out lately, it is just sort of shocking at how expensive it is to eat out. Now, don't get me wrong, we all enjoy it. It's great to go out, have the food prepared, order what we want, and then you don't have to worry about the dishes. Makes good sense, right? Except for the fact that it's really, really, really expensive. That's one of the areas where inflation has hit the most, is in the restaurant industry. So make sure you kind of take a look at that, particularly if you're looking to save money. We got one more tip in terms of saving money that we're going to share with you, but we've got to go to the break. So stay tuned through the break as we continue the conversation here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. So before we get to our main topics of things that you need to do when you're preparing to retire in that year leading up to that retirement date, and how much money you need to have in your emergency savings account, we thought we would start the program off with just some suggestions on how you might save money in the first place. If you missed that prior segment, you know that we covered the first four. Number one, creating a budget. Number two, automating that savings. Number three, reviewing your account statements. That's kind of a new one, or a newish one in today's world. We all have those recurring charges for products and services and goods that we're not actually using. Maybe even forgot that we signed up for. Make sure you check those statements out for those kinds of things. Number four, eating out. Boy, this is a sensitive one. I know I like to eat out just as much as anybody else, but wow, is it expensive these days. So if you're going to save money, maybe reduce down how many times you're eating out every month. And then lastly, check your rates. And what we mean by that is check your interest rate that you're paying on any of the debt that you have, particularly credit cards. But at the same point in time, check your interest rate that you're making on any savings that you have as well. The reality is that credit card rates, particularly in today's interest rate environment, really have become very expensive, particularly those store ones, right, that you get to save 10% off on a purchase. That's great. That's how the store gets you. The reality is, though, if you carry a balance on those types of cards, those store credit cards have some of the highest interest rates applicable to them these days, north of 30%. So the 10% you save to buy the sweater, well, sweaters don't really sell much here in Florida, but a pair of shorts, then ultimately you're winding up paying back 3 times the amount of that savings on that purchase, particularly when you're paying 30% of an interest rate. On the flip side, if you have cash, if you have savings, if you have dollars that you're holding on to, double check how much those dollars are earning because the savings rates can vary widely. Many banks haven't really bothered to adjust the interest rate that they're paying when you have cash on hand with them. Make sure you're taking a look at that and checking that out as well. Need help on any of this? We encourage you to check out Chapter 4 of our book, Next Gen Dollars and Cents. Don't have a copy of the book? Well, why not? Because while you can order it instantaneously on Amazon, that'll cost you $14.99. What you can do, though, as an alternative, is come on in for a free conversation at the office. We'll give you a copy of the book absolutely free. No obligation whatsoever. And also, if you're interested and you like an electronic format, the book is available as an ebook as well. That's on the various platforms for like $4.99. And then we also have some chapter videos as well that we are in the process of rolling out. So make sure you check out all of that. This, of course, is Dollars and Cents. Make sure you check out that program as well on your favorite podcast platform. One of Central Florida's longest running radio programs, also happen to be a top 25 financial planning podcast. My name is Joel Garris, a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning. So a lot of money these days sitting in cash, right? Money market accounts alone have north of $2.7 trillion. That's a lot of money. And certainly that's a better place to have money, particularly money markets, because they wind up paying a little bit more interest rate, right? So particularly in comparison to like a regular savings account or a checking account that you would get at a bank. But at the end of the day, with that much money sitting in cash and money markets and the like, it really does sort of beg the question of how much should you have in a savings account. So we're going to try and tackle that topic on this segment of the program. And understand it's easy to, we get it. It's easy to just have that money sit and not really look at it. And if it's sitting in a savings account, that's good because clearly that serves the function of having an emergency savings account in the first place. And that is certainly so crucial to have. But what's the right amount? And I think far too often people sometimes steer higher than what they need to. Certainly the suggestions that you would read online are all over the map, right? You got to save 20% of each paycheck. You got to save 12 months of income. And so to find the right answer of what sort of is the happy medium in terms of this conversation, it's important to think about why you need money in a savings account in the first place, right? So what's the point of savings account money? Generally, it's for emergencies or things that you're planning on purchasing in the immediate term. So better yet, the point of those emergency savings, if you will, is to help prevent a difficult event from actually becoming an emergency. So emergency savings designed to, in fact, prevent an emergency that can get pretty rough should you not have the money to cover the cost of said emergency, right? Stop and think about that, just how stressful it can be if you don't have money to cover some of the things in life that can just pop up, right? Maybe it's a car repair, maybe it's a medical expense, or a repair of a roof or something like that for your home. That's a lot of stress. If you don't have the money to cover it, that stress can get compounded and ultimately cause you to maybe do things that aren't very good from a financial perspective, particularly if you're putting it on a credit card and incurring at 30% rate and so forth. So how do you determine sort of how much to put into a savings? Well, the answer, as with any of these kinds of topics, is it kind of depends, right, in terms of what's the right amount for you. But we're going to give you 4 distinct categories for you to kind of reflect on and to think through and figure out which sort of category you fall in, and then that ultimately drives how much you ultimately need to save in your emergency savings account. So category 1, sort of the first category, and this one's going to surprise you of the direction that we're going to go on this. But if you are in debt, okay, meaning you owe on credit cards specifically, then frankly, you probably want to have the least amount of savings possible. And I know that sounds kind of an opposite of what you would think, but the reality is that I don't care how much money you got in savings. If you got a credit card that's costing you 30%, you are losing money. So if you're in debt, if you're in that first category, then in fact, you may actually want to have your savings be much less or nearly negligible, because you really want to get rid of that credit card, particularly if it's costing you 30%. So that's category 1, where if you're in debt, you may want to have less in your emergency savings account than what you might think, particularly if you've got something that's costing you 30%. You want to make sure that the dollars are going to that to pay that down, to get rid of that as quickly as possible. So kind of the flip, if you will, of what you might expect on that one. Category 2, if your income and expenses relatively stable, then that's probably where the general rule of thumb that you see online comes into play, 3 to 6 months of expenses. Now, here's the thing to remember. Living expenses is not your gross income, right? Your gross income is always going to be much, much higher. Living expenses is sort of what you do with the net amount of your pay that comes in. So understand where that category comes into play. Relatively stable income and expenses, then your traditional rule of 3 to 6 months. If on the other hand, you find yourself in category 3, where your income and expenses are somewhat inconsistent, like if you're self-employed, gig worker, or seasonal, then you probably want to have a little bit more in emergency savings to weather through those particular times when things are slower. So in that case, you may want to consider 6 to 12 months of those living expenses in savings. And then the last category is if you've got a big purchase coming up in the near term. So maybe that's a house down payment, a need for a new car. then those cases, you're going to want to have much more than 12 months of living expenses in that savings account because you want to make sure you've got the money to cover that. We're going to take a break and wrap up all of this when we continue here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. So which of those 4 categories do you fall in? It's important to know which of those categories you fall in because that helps to really determine how much you need to have in your emergency savings account, right? First category is if you're in debt, you probably want to have the least amount of possible because if you got debt or credit cards that are charging you 30%, pretty much want to have every available dollar go to get those things paid off. Second category is if you've got relatively stable income and expenses, okay, you can have that traditional sort of rule of thumb of somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 6 months of savings that is set aside. Remember, when we talk about this, it's important to distinguish between living expenses, sort of the net income that you need each and every month versus the gross, right? Gross income, well, that's, that from that gross income, you wind up paying Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, income taxes, things like that sort of come right off the top. When you think about emergency savings, you always want to relate that to your net income or ultimately how much you spend on those various living expenses. Category 3, those people that find themselves in inconsistent patterns where your income, your expenses are not particularly consistent. Maybe you're a seasonal worker, maybe you're a contractor, maybe you get paid commissions, things like that, or on a self-employed basis. In that case, you probably want to have a little bit more emergency savings, so somewhere in that 6 to 12 months. And then lastly, that 4th category, if you've got a big purchase coming up, you probably want to have all of the money that you've earmarked for that purchase, whether that's a down payment on a car or a down payment on a house, then ultimately you want all of that to be sitting in some kind of a savings account because that is money that you're going to use in the near term. So you would, in that case, want to have a larger savings account than what you might already have. So which category do you fall in? Think about those 4 categories as it relates to your emergency savings and your savings accounts, because what category you are in sort of drives how much you really should be having in your emergency savings types of accounts. If you got more than that, and many people do, then it might be time to think about other options. Should I fund an IRA? Should I fund a Roth? Should I increase the contributions that I'm making to my employer plan? All of those other things then come into play if you find that you've got more than you really need in terms of your emergency savings. So important to understand what category you fall in along the way. So in terms of other important things to consider, we're going to shift gears in this segment and talk a little bit about some of those things that you want to do in the year or two leading up to retirement, right? Getting close to retirement. And ultimately, you start planning. These are the kinds of conversations that the team at Nelson Financial Planning has with people each and every day. And ultimately, the focus of those conversations, and it certainly should be the focus of those conversations, are clearly looking at the financial side of things, right? Looking at what you own, what you owe, money in, money out, what's the income going to look like in retirement, what's the expenses going to look like in retirement. All of that makes perfect sense. That's the very heart of retirement planning, retirement income planning, all of those kinds of things. Well, in this segment, we wanted to put 5 other maybe less financial, but certainly more practical things on the table for you to consider incorporating into your life in that year prior to retiring, because what you'll find is these 5 suggestions are in fact things that you can't do once you retire. So we'll cover that here next on Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. One of Central Florida's longest running radio programs, also a top 25 financial planning podcast. Make sure you subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform or visit our YouTube channel as well. Any trouble finding us, go to our website, Nelson Financial Planning. There you'll get to see the various icons. Click on those. Those will get you instantly connected. Once you're there, make sure you subscribe so you don't have to go through that process again. My name, of course, is Joel Garris, certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great folks who also happen to be certified financial fiduciaries as well. But they also have other areas of expertise. Some of them may be certified financial planners. Some of them may be National Social Security advisors. Some of them may be IRS enrolled agents or certified public accountants. That's our team approach at Nelson Financial Planning, where we've got a team of experts that stand ready to help you improve your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. Boy, I'll tell you, that cost-effective concept is pretty crucial out there these days. We're seeing costs of financial services for individual investors continue to go up and up and up. Make sure you have a handle on how much it is that you are paying. We saw one just the other day, and this was actually inside of his employer plan, where someone had convinced him to move into the self-directed sleeve inside this plan and use these funds that where the expense ratio was 2.25%. And ultimately, it was an incredibly expensive investment that was redirecting some of that directly back to the financial services company at a relatively high number, particularly in light of how much money this particular individual had invested. So make sure you check out that part as well anytime you're analyzing and running the numbers, the financial side of things. But shifting gears a little bit, here are the 5 sort of non-financial, more practical, life-oriented suggestions for you to consider doing in that year leading up to retirement. Certainly makes sense to understand the very fundamentals, but here they are. Number 1, make the most of your employer-provided benefits. Stop and think about that one for a minute. You can't do that once you retire, right? Make the most of your employer-provided benefits, particularly your paid time off. It amazes me how many people retire and leave paid time off on the books. That is your money. Look at your employer policy. Find out whether they're going to pay it out or whether it's just going to evaporate. Here locally, you can lose up to 75% of your sick time when you retire for certain local employers. Imagine that. You had all the sick days saved up and you're losing the entirety of 75% of them. Make sure you take a moment and look at what your employer provided benefits are and make sure you're maximizing those out, particularly in that year or two prior to retirement. So again, we said these are going to be a little bit more practical, not maybe purely financial, but that's number 1. Number 2, look ahead and see if you've got a big expense looming, right? Is there maybe a roof that's going to need repair? Is there a car that is going to need to be purchased? Is there some home improvements that need to be done? This really relates to the extent that you're looking at maybe getting a home equity line. It's easier to get a home equity line when you are still working because you have provable income in the form of a paycheck that you get every 2 weeks or every week or every month or however you get paid. That is much more usable income from the bank's perspective to ultimately give you and approve you for a home equity line of credit or home equity loan. To the extent you're going down that path, and because you're doing that because you've got some big expenses, then, hey, you probably want to get that taken care of while you are still working versus when you shift to retirement. Number 3 on this list is getting a medical checkup. The reality is, chances are your employer health plan, probably a pretty good one, might perhaps be better than what you would get if you're just getting an individual policy. So taking advantage of that certainly makes sense, particularly if you've used all the copay, right? That's how those work as we get to the sort of the end of the year, if you've met your deductible, right, then certainly having something else medical happen means that you don't have to pay anything more on that deductible side of things. So we're going to continue this conversation after these messages here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. So on the program, we're talking about some of the things that you should do in the year leading up to retirement that aren't maybe purely financially related. Now, don't get me wrong. You need to have that full financial analysis, really plan out where your retirement income is going to come from, how to do that in the most tax efficient manner possible, how much money do you have, how much money do you owe, what's your income going to look like, what's your expenses, all of that, the full-blown financial analysis. Those are the conversations we have every day with people in the office at Nelson Financial Planning. But there's also some things that you want to be looking at as well that are of a more practical nature, and that's what we're talking about on the program this week. If you missed that prior segment, we talked about two or three of them. First is make sure you take full advantage of your employer-provided benefits, right? Don't leave paid time off on the table. Those are days that have been paid for, and if you walk out the door without using them, then you might never get paid for them. So make sure you're taking a moment and review those employer-provided benefits, particularly in that last year or two before you retire. Number two on our list was looking ahead to seeing if there's a big expense. Maybe there's some home improvements or some home repairs that need to be done. Look, folks, the reality is getting a home equity line of credit on your home is easier when you are still working than when you are retired. Certainly, it's not saying that it's not possible when you're retired to get such a home equity line, but it is, in fact, easier when you've got that regular provable income in the form of a regular paycheck. Number three, get a medical checkup. Chances are your employer plan might be better than what you're going to in retirement, particularly if you've met all of your deductible, right? Here we are. We're getting into the last quarter of the year. If you've met your deductible already, then if you've got a medical issue that needs to be dealt with, then you don't have to pay more towards that deductible. Number four is to give your retirement budget a test run. This one is great. I know a lot of people do that when we're sitting visiting with people in the office. We encourage folks to do that just to get an understanding and a handle on what that's going to look like. Make sure you haven't missed anything either. Maybe you forgot to account for taxes. Let's hope not. Or maybe you forgot to account for the cost of your health insurance. Let's really hope not on that one, because those are two biggies that ultimately you're going to wind up having to pay when you retire on a monthly basis. So give that retirement budget a little bit of a test run, if you will. And then lastly, speaking of that same topic, research your health insurance options. It's important to really have an understanding of what those options are going to be, particularly if you're under age 65. If you're at 65, over 65, then obviously you've got the choice of Medicare, but there's like an alphabet soup of different supplements and plans and things like that. So make sure you're taking the time to really dig into that and take a look at that. So at the end of the day, some sort of real practical suggestions, right, that you can follow a year or two out from retirement. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you got to do the hard number analysis of what the overall finances are. But our team at Nelson Financial Planning, found that at the end of the day, it's not solely about the financials. There's really some more practical implications that really help to improve the quality of your retirement if you're understanding that perspective from a more practical sort of point of view. So those are the things to be aware of here on this week's program of Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. So as usual, sort of a full show this week. Both of our primary topics: what to do in the year before you retire, and how much to keep in your emergency savings account. involve saving money. So, as we said at the beginning of the program, 5 things that you can do to help improve your savings rates. Those are creating a budget. And for more information on that, check out chapter 4 of our book, Next Gen Dollars and Cents. You can get that free copy simply by scheduling a no fee, no obligation conversation with any of our folks at Nelson Financial Planning. There you can pick up that copy when you come on in for that conversation. Number 2, automate your savings, right? Things that are automated happen much more easily than if they're not. Also takes advantage of that concept of paying yourself first, right? Pay yourself first in terms of saving for money. If you pay yourself last, then chances are that there's probably not going to be as much left over at the end as you would like. Review those account statements. Boy, this is one that's certainly, I think, applicable more now in today's world where we have so much of those recurring expenses that are happening. Guarantee you've got 1, 2, maybe even 3 or 4 that you're not using, and it's still getting charged, and maybe even weren't aware of that. Double check all of that. Great way to find some money to save by looking at those recurring charges. And then number 4 is a favorite among many people, but the cost of eating out these days has just really skyrocketed, particularly over the past couple of years. Double check how much you're spending there. If it's an excessive number and you can cut it, that's a great way to come up with money to save and increase your emergency savings. And then lastly, check your rates. Check your rates on how much your debt is costing you. And how much your savings is in fact earning in terms of savings rates. The sooner you do that, better off you will be, and ultimately give some perspective on how much you should have in your emergency savings. If you remember that conversation from earlier in the program, it really depends on what category you are in. Are you in a category where you have debt? If you have debt, then you probably want to have a minimal amount of emergency savings because you got to use those dollars to pay towards those higher interest rate, particularly if we're talking credit card debt. If you've got relatively stable income and expenses, okay, well, the traditional metric of 3 to 6 months of savings probably makes good sense. If you've got a little bit more uncertainty, maybe you're a gig worker, a seasonal worker, maybe you're self-employed, then you may want to have somewhere in the 6 to 12 month range. And if you're in that last category where you've got a big purchase coming up, ultimately then that's important to keep the bulk of that sitting in savings so that you can use that. Maybe you're using that for a down payment on a house. Maybe that you're using that for a down payment on a car. Those kinds of things would necessitate you having that a higher level of emergency savings in that. Now, if you find that you've got a higher level of emergency savings than probably what you really need to have, then that's when you look at additional alternatives for how to position that money. Maybe that's funding a Roth, maybe that's funding an IRA, maybe that's increasing how much you're contributing to that employer plan at work. All of those good ways to utilize those dollars, because at the end of the day, money sitting in an emergency savings account makes a little bit of interest, but it doesn't make a ton of interest, and there's no tax benefits per se to doing that. So you may find that you've got better options elsewhere, particularly once you've sort of satisfied, once you've figured out which category you are in terms of the amount that you should have for emergency savings. But then if you've got above and beyond that number, then certainly to explore some other options as well. So important to get, as always, perspective and advice on these kinds of issues. If you have any questions, give us a call to set up that absolutely free conversation. When you do that, we will give you a free copy of our book, Next Gen Dollars and Cents, that really does talk a lot about the things that we talk about on a weekly basis here on this program. Also, be sure to check out the chapter videos that we're in the process of producing for each chapter on the book itself, rolling those out at a pace of about 1 per week. So ultimately, they serve as sort of a companion guide to the book itself. So certainly important important to try and stay on top of all of the different concepts and changes that are happening. That's why we do this show on a weekly basis. Always remember, we don't charge for conversations in office. And unlike many other firms, we don't have account minimums either. That means we are truly here to help you in any way we can. So that's what being a fiduciary is all about. Make sure you check us out on our website, Nelson Financial Planning, to schedule that free conversation. My name is Joel Garris. You've been listening to Dollars and Cents.